Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this forum today on the future of the MBTA. My name is Lungo-Koehn. I'm the Executive Director of the MBTA Advisory Board. It is my great honor to introduce the Chairman of the MBTA Advisory Board, Mayor Tom Koch. Mayor Koch is the 33rd Mayor of Quincy, first elected in 2007, and has been reelected 5 times and is now the longest-serving mayor in Quincy's history. He has served as chair of the MBTA Advisory Board for over a decade, and last year was elected by his colleagues from the cities and towns to the MBTA Board of Directors as their municipal representative. He was subsequently appointed to the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Board of Directors by Governor Baker and is currently the vice chair of the MBTA Board of Directors. Mayor Koch.
Good morning. Thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody to this forum talking about the future of our MBTA. And I do want to thank Brian for starts. We've seen a kind of a new enthusiasm with the MBTA board, and really a great respect now from the state with the legislature passing the addition of a member from the advisory board to serve on the board of directors. That's a huge change. So we're more than just on the outside trying to bang on the windows to get attention. We now have a seat at the table. So I'm grateful for Brian's work as leadership, but also for the work of all the committees that we've set up and the seriousness by which a number of the leaders from our communities have taken these committees with some great discussions and moving forward. So I know that I won't call them old timers, but there's some long-serving members of the advisory board that their voices now can be heard. So thank you to everybody for that, and welcome everybody to this forum. We're going to start off with my good friend, the mayor of Salem, Kim Driscoll, who I've known for all my years as mayor because she's been around a little bit longer than I have as mayor, but her service in public service is pretty remarkable, serving her city of Salem, but also the state and the region, her service on the Metropolitan Area Council in North Shore. She's on the school committee, God love you, and certainly a city councilor. But more importantly, she really embodies the best of public service. She looks at issues and tries to resolve those issues. And that's what we need in government today. Enough of the, the positioning, the extreme sides. We need to get together, come together, and come up with solutions. And Kim's done that her whole career. So I want to welcome Mayor Driscoll to open up our forum this morning.
Hey, good morning, everyone. It's great to see you, Tom, Brian, you as well, and everyone who's on. Really appreciate it. It's not that long ago that I was a young planner here in the planning department and was assigned the task of the representative to the MBTA advisory board, and really recall that being fundamental to understanding the needs within our communities, how we sort of crowdsource getting the best sort of treatment and examples in that communication with the T, knowing how critical transportation is in so many of our communities. I would just say for folks who aren't familiar with Salem, we're so fortunate that we are one of the busiest commuter rail stops in the MBTA system. The T has been key to a lot of Salem's growth, knowing that you could live in our community, which is just 14 miles north of Boston, but can feel hard to get to, but worth it. The MBTA has been a key way of not only getting people back and forth to work and school and medical appointments and the like, but key to the growth of our community. I'm fortunate enough to have been mayor in Salem now. This is my 17th year. I had the good pleasure of serving with Mayor Koch, which has allowed me to see a lot with respect to the transportation landscape. The growth of our community being the accessibility being key that the T provides, and also some of the challenges that come when the T is not working well that we're all familiar with. I'm now in a position running for lieutenant governor, partnered with Maura Healey. Couldn't ask for a better partner, someone who's capable, committed, willing to lean in on doing the hard stuff. And I think we're going to have some hard stuff to do with respect to transportation. We've been really clear about the work ahead with respect to the MBTA. The need for the transit system to be safe is key and at the top of that list. One of the key aspects of the transportation policy put out so far has been the appointment of a transportation safety chief to understand within the relevant transportation agencies how we can ensure we have a full safety review so people can use our public transit with confidence. And obviously, that's operations work, that's capital work, that's not just T, but roads and bridges as well. The fact that we're at the stage that we're in right now, in some ways, is not a surprise to those of us who've been watching how we're investing in transportation, or maybe I should say how we're not investing in transportation. as mayor, I've made a commitment here in my community to be what we call a car light city. So we have worked hard to expand opportunities for people to get around without a car. We have a very successful rideshare service known as Salem Skipper. We've given over 95,000 rides to date. It's an Uber-based platform using that innovation to allow people to move around. We think of that as part of our mobility hub. We've got the train station, we have the rideshare service, we have a car share service partnered with GetAround, where you can have an on-demand, low-cost, hourly car rental 24/7. We also have obviously traditional bike share programs. Early in my tenure as mayor, we also bought our own boat. We bought a ferry. We had some assistance from the state to help do that and use that as another means to get people back and forth between Boston. I do feel like water transportation is an opportunity in the Commonwealth for us to pursue, to provide alternative public transportation options, particularly in our coastal cities. Not many metropolitan cities the size of Boston don't take advantage of the water as a way to get people back and forth. That frees up some of the congestion on our roadway, allows for greater access on public transit, and allows that tandem. If you've been to New York, you might take the ferry in, or you might take the train in. You have those options. It makes for better public transportation circumstances all around. I also want to say I know how key transportation upgrades and expansion are to the quality of life throughout Massachusetts. The work we're seeing on the South Coast to connect parts of New Bedford and Fall River to Boston, what that can mean for opening up additional housing, workforce region needs in that region is critical. Obviously, East-West Rail has been something that's been high on the agenda for a number of years. That's really coming together in terms of some of the resources from the federal government coming to support that, opening up pockets of our Commonwealth that previously have had a much more difficult time growing their economy, getting people to the capital city in an easier format. And I would also say, as we think about our housing needs, one of the key needs I'm hearing, Maura's hearing in every community we go into is the lack of housing that's affordable to meet community needs. And with housing choice, the desire to think about transit-oriented development, where we're building housing in a higher density fashion around our transit nodes. Well, that only works if you actually have transit that's working and working well. So the investments in our transportation system are going to be key to ensure that we're able to grow our economy from a workforce perspective, from a housing perspective, and that people have confidence in taking that public transit. So as part of the work of the safety, the transportation and safety chief, we also want to make sure we're operating in a more, transparent, clear, quantifiable way with respect to expectations and corrective action plans. It doesn't do anybody any good if we're undertaking sort of a crisis planning mode, finding out about shutdowns in short time frames, or not having, frankly, the information as a consumer to know what your alternatives might be when we have to take maintenance work, important maintenance work. We're heading into a time frame in 2023 where one of our tunnels is going to be closed, or not just on the weekends, for an extended period of time. How do we think about upticks in public transportation to help address the needs that we're not going to be able to have as much as the car traveling on those corridors as much as we can? And I would also say as much as we need to support the current system, we know there are investments that need to be made. We want to be open and transparent about that with quantifiable metrics on performance. We also know that expansion exists, whether that's in communities that are already being served by the T or places that are not. I think we're hoping to be in a position to work with our transit advocates, work with our community leaders, work with all stakeholders to ensure that we're implementing, not only safety and communication procedures across all transportation departments, but hearing about where we can partner from a public and private perspective to grow our economy around transportation, around housing to meet those key needs. The only way we do that is by the type of communication that happens with this organization, being in a position to understand what's happening on the ground in your communities. As local officials, I know Mayor Koch will agree with this. There's no hiding in local government, right? You know what's happening in your community, and that can be powerful to work with state leaders, work with T officials and others to ensure we're meeting the demands in our communities. And when there are service interruptions and calls for maintenance or calls for growth, we need local leaders at the forefront of those conversations, helping us plan for the work and plan for the alternatives. And just the last piece I'll pick up on is, ensuring that we're thinking about the work that we're doing for our transportation system, not just through the lens of what's going to happen over the next 4 years. transportation needs to be about investing for the next generation, things that we'll never cut the ribbon on, but recognizing those are the investments we're making for the next generation. We're proud of Massachusetts history by having the first public transportation system, first public subway system, but we now have a responsibility to make those next generational benefits. It's not lost on me. I know it won't be lost on Mayor Koch either. Both of our cities are turning 400 over the course of the next few years. There's about a dozen cities in Massachusetts between 2020 and 2030 will hit their quadricentennial, 400 years old. And I think that's a place marker for us. We're not just thinking about the needs of today, but you're a 400-year-old city. We have quite a history, but we also have a really, a proud past, but a bright future. And that means we need to make the sorts of investments, whether that's electrifying stations, operating in a more efficient way that's going to serve the next generation of riders. I'm hopeful to be in a position to help influence it, grateful to be teamed up with a partner like Maura Healy, who I know wants to lean into this work, who understands that we can't have a functioning economy without a functioning public transportation system, and really is committed to working together in concert with all of you and others to make sure we've got the best team in place to take on these tasks in the months and years ahead. So thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you for your service, not only to Salem, but to the entire region on the MBTA Advisory Board. And good luck in the upcoming election.
21 days to go. Not that I'm counting.
Thank you, ma'am. So we're going to turn to our first panel at this time. And it is my great honor to introduce another member of the MBTA Advisory Board. Mayor Breanna Lungo-Koehn is currently serving in her second term as mayor of Medford. Prior to being elected mayor, she served 18 years on the city council, having first been elected at age 21. In addition to leading the city through the COVID-19 pandemic as mayor, she's implemented a number of wide-ranging policies and initiatives, such as the city's first ever comprehensive strategic plan and capital improvement plan. Professionalizing city staff by creating a new standalone Department of Human Resources, hiring the city's first economic development director, creating an office of planning, development, and stability, and revamped the city's outdated budget process in favor of accountability and transparency, for which the city has received national awards. The mayor has been a staunch advocate for increased accessibility to public transit. She has overseen the installation of the first ever Blue Bikes station in Medford, with 3 additional stations opening this month, and was a vocal critic of the T's Orange Line shutdown, stressing the need for more robust communication strategy with local municipalities, and has been pushing the MBTA to reconsider its cuts to the bus network in Medford. In her spare time, and it's hard to believe she has any, the mayor volunteers as a youth sports coach and is an avid runner. And prior to her time as mayor, she owned a law firm. And along with her husband, Dave, they are the proud parents of 3 children, which is the hardest job of all. It is my great honor to introduce our member, Mayor Breanna Lungo-Koehn.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you having me here today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us as we discuss oversight and management of the MBTA. Joining me today are 3 people who no doubt have a lot to say on this issue. First up, we have Joe Aiello, former chairman of the MBTA Fiscal and Management Control Board from 2015 to 2021, former North American CEO and board member of international infrastructure company Meridium, currently a senior fellow at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at Tufts University. We also have Dan Grabauskas, Massachusetts Secretary of Transportation from 2003 to 2005, General Manager of the MBTA 2005 to 2009, CEO of Honolulu Authority for Rapid Transportation from 2012 to 2016, and currently an independent transportation consultant at Grabauskas Consulting. And last up, but not least, Fred Salvucci, Massachusetts Secretary of Transportation from 1975 to 1978, and again from 1983 to 1990. Fred participated in the expansion of the Massachusetts transit system, the development of financial and political support for the Central Artery Tunnel Project, the Big Dig, and the design of implementation strategies to comply with the Clean Air Act consistent with economic growth. Fred is a senior lecturer at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Welcome, Dan, Joe, and Fred. Appreciate you being here. I'm going to just start off and ask a question about the T's board of directors and ask if you have any opinions about the management structure, whether it's appropriate at the time being, or has been appropriate in the past. And if you have any comments, I'll turn it over to Dan to start us off there.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here, and thank you very much, Madam Mayor, and to my fellow panelists. Welcome and good morning. So interestingly enough, I guess I could say that I was maybe the last general manager that the board at that time stylized itself as a policy board rather than a management board, in contrast to what was headed up with the Fiscal Management Control Board. And I guess there were good things and bad things about that. The good thing was that there was pretty clear authority that was given to the general manager, delegated by the board. In fact, there was actually a booklet that was handed to every general manager at the time that said, here are the things that you're responsible for, and then here are the things that the board is responsible for. So it was a pretty clear delineation, day-to-day management, hiring and firing within the authority, and so on. Small contracts at that time was defined as under $500,000 a year were pretty much the purview of the GM, and the board itself reserved for review of major policy decisions. While for instance, the general manager might negotiate labor contracts, final approval was given to the board, and the board set general direction. They approved large contracts. So there was kind of this, at that time anyway, more of an expectation that the GM was the manager. The board led through its policy direction and major decision-making that they voted in public once a month. So it seemed to work at the time. I can only speak into my own experience. We weren't just, but as general manager, I can just say I wasn't just looking at the board for direction. By virtue of whoever was Secretary of Transportation at the time, that person was de facto automatically the chair of the board. So that the governor had a strong voice right at the center of the table. The advisory board had a strong voice in that they had a hand in the recommendations for appointments to the board. They had veto power over the budget. They could not add to the line items, but they could reduce. And then certainly the myriad mayors, select boards, aldermanic boards that in the communities we serve all had a voice and believe me, directly contacted the general manager. So at that time, I think the idea was to try to balance a strong manager with accountability through the board. And the final thing I'll just mention is that the board at that time was also the appointing authority. So the board hired and fired. And that sort of gave me, as a general manager, a direction to say, first and foremost, if I had a question about where we were headed, the board was where I went. And again, the board had many facets that it represented by the people who were appointed, but that's where it went. So if that helps people give some context, that was the world that I lived in back prior to 2009.
Great, thank you, Dan. And I'll turn it on over to Joseph. And maybe you could talk more, if I'm sure all three of you follow the current situation and the current board of directors. So maybe just elaborate on how you feel the current board management structure is, and whether they're too deeply involved in the day-to-day or are too hands-off, and where we should, go into the future.
Sure. Well, let me pick off from where Dan ended. One of the things that happened after Dan left was that the legislature effectively abolished the MBTA board, and governance of the T ended up being part of the mission of the Mass DOT, which is a statewide obligation over many, many, many things. And I think that change can, while it was done in good faith by the legislature to try to find efficiencies in government and collapsing departments, failed to appreciate the uniqueness of what it takes to run the T, and probably accelerated what was already, while Dan was there, and I'm sure he'll tell you, sort of 20 years of underinvestment in the T, and led to the collapse in 2015. So I was part of the board, the Fiscal Management Control Board, that the legislature and the governor created, that was mandated to be an activist board. You don't tell a board that you must meet a minimum of 3 times a month if you don't intend it to be activist, and you don't have other powers granted to you that were sort of unusual. And, I would say, consistent with what Dan said, the delegation of authority and the difference between the board and what the board was responsible for and what the general manager was responsible for was very, very clear. But it's also true, it's true in public life, it's also true in the private sector. If you have an organization that is in absolute crisis and melting down in almost any dimension you can imagine, a board has to take extraordinary measures to really push the envelope, to be supportive of the general manager, et cetera. And we struggled to find a general manager. We had multiple interim general managers in the Fiscal and Management Control Board. We had one failed search for a general manager. We had a general manager just, there was a misfit between that person's skills and what happened. And then we were fortunate, and I say this, and this is a lot of people are going to think I'm crazy. We're fortunate that we had Steve Poptak on the board as the deputy chair to me, who we, the board and the secretary, approached to ask if he would step up to become general manager, with the notion that he had to sort of stick at it and get at it. He took measures around safety immediately. He replaced the director of safety. He understood that that was a malignant problem within the T. We collaborated around the safety panel that the board called for, made sure that every department, every individual, all the unions participated openly in that. And I think he was beginning to making headway on safety when all of a sudden COVID comes. And obviously that changes the dynamic about how effective and how quickly you can change the culture and how quickly you can change protocols, et cetera. Needless to say, our term ended, and now we've gone to another end of the spectrum, which is a board that is probably, I would call, a normalized board, but I think it was premature. So I think there's still a period of time where the T needs a board that is a bit more active, perhaps not as active as the FMCB. I think that was one extreme. That was a legislative and gubernatorial response to an absolute crisis, which the place is still in crisis. And I would just argue that we need to find some balance, have a somewhat more aggressive board positioning, still for a couple of years looking forward, but absolutely committed. The place needs a very strong general manager to run it on a day-to-day basis. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. I'll turn it over to you, Fred, and add, what is the right degree of board involvement in the operations and management of the T today?
I'll be in the odd position of agreeing with Dan somewhat and disagreeing slightly with Joe. Joe and I are longtime friends. I wish when the central problem at the MBTA is that the dedicated funding was misestimated back in the year 2000. The organization has not had enough money to properly maintain its assets. And if that's not fixed, it doesn't matter what board structure or general manager you put. If there's not enough money to basically maintain what you have and provide decent service, you cannot succeed. That has to get fixed. And I wish that Governor Baker had fixed that and made Joe Aiello general manager, and then we'd have a system under the form that Dan Grabauskas described, and I think the system would be working. But if you don't put dedicated funding, then you don't create the stability and the long-term vision of properly maintaining assets. Not to say anything negative about the legislature, it is if you subject something to annual prior appropriation by the legislature, which is what happened in the year 2000, you've got T service competing with urgent needs, healthcare, education, et cetera, and you never get the money for deferred maintenance. When I served as Secretary of Transportation, I was there 12 years. 11 of those 12 years, we could not get a snow and ice budget out of the legislature that was adequate. The attitude was, budget is set in July, around end of the fiscal year. It's hot. Maybe it's not going to snow this year. Come on, guys. It was all guys then. Come on, guys. It will snow. This is New England. It will snow. They'd never, 11 years out of 12, they gave us a totally inadequate snow and ice budget. Following winter, surprise, surprise, it would snow. And there'd be a deficiency budget. Which didn't allow any kind of prior management. It's in the nature of prior appropriation of a legislature, which has dozens and dozens of urgent items, that there's not enough money to think about proper preventative maintenance, either for highways or for transit. So to me, the central thing is getting a dedicated budget that's adequate. That's going to take legislation. It's not where we are now. On the governance side, I strongly prefer the governance model that Dan Grabauskas described. I saw several governance models back when I worked for the city of Boston, and I served actually representing Mayor White on the advisory board, so I'm familiar with the advisory board role. At that time, there was a board with staggered terms appointed by the governor, not accountable to anybody, and nice people, but they were kind of, Sargent was governor and they were accountable to John Volpe. No sense of teamwork with the Secretary Altshuler, who was a great secretary, couldn't get a phone call returned. They were just from a different country. That system was reformed to create much more gubernatorial accountability by Altshuler. He did a brilliant job of it. He involved the legislature. And I inherited in 1975 the Altshuler structure, which actually had the chief executive officer, now called the general manager, serving at the pleasure of the governor. Very clear gubernatorial accountability in the system. But the advisory board, as Dan described, the term advisory is really a misnomer, because the advisory board had the budget authority, as Dan pointed out, to cut but not add. But the advisory board was a real force with various positions that had to be approved by the advisory board as well. So there was some appointing authority as well as budget, but the budget was the big item. There was then some further change. The next time I was in the government, it was much more, almost exactly what Dan described. As secretary, I served as chair of the board, 6 members coterminous with the governor, accountable to the governor, appointed by the governor. Much better sense of teamwork because we all knew what the accountability was. I think that model works. If I would change anything, which would require legislation, I would, first of all, have a dedicated fund. Secondly, I'd have the advisory board with full authority to add as well as subtract from the budget. Because if you're going to really take care of deferred maintenance and safety issues, sometimes you have to add to the budget. So I would strengthen the advisory board role, restore it at least to where Dan experienced it, but I would add some power to that. But first and foremost, I put enough money into the system so that the general manager can succeed at running a good service. I think that's the most critical issue.
Great. Thank you, Fred. And now we have some gals too. So hopefully the guys and gals in the legislature can fully fund what's necessary for the T.
Well, the guys screwed it up bad enough, so the gals have got to help.
Okay.
I'm delighted to see that.
so.
I hope we're going to have 2 gals as governor and lieutenant governor.
Yes, absolutely. Sounds good. Okay. Before I move on to question 2, I'll tell you I won't take any offense to your answers, or maybe just a little, but as long as you say we should be communicated with. The next question is, what role do and should political considerations play in the T oversight and management? And I'll turn it over to Joe, if you don't mind.
Well, by its nature, it's a political body. It's a public utility. And obviously, political policy preferences are gonna change from time to time, depending upon who the governor is and what the sense of the legislature is, et cetera. But let's not confuse legitimate policy and political considerations with the need for effective, skilled leadership and skilled technical people within the authority. You cannot, that place cannot be a dumping ground in any way, shape, or form. You can see the preciousness of lives that get lost, of people that get hurt. If you don't invest, as Fred was talking about, equally, if you don't have the right people in the right jobs, you're going to continue to subject the public to non-optimal service and unsafe conditions. So got to separate those two. Yes, political and policy implications are part of the natural discussion of us as citizens and our elected officials, but we've got to make sure we get the very best talent inside that organization and pay them to retain them as well and invest in them.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I'll turn it over to you, Fred. Political considerations, how they play in the T oversight and management. Should they have a larger voice in the process and in solutions, or are we good where we're at?
I agree with what Joe just said. The politics of hiring Uncle Louie for a job does not belong here. Politics of the governor being serious about policy and putting in competent people to execute it and putting enough money to actually run it, that's good politics, and the team needs good politics.
Thank you. Dan, same question.
Well, I guess I was just thinking of when I was Secretary of Transportation, as Fred mentioned, I was chairman of the board, and Mike Mulhern was the general manager at the time. And when Mike would hear complaints from some of the staff about, taking calls from local officials or what have you, he would direct them to the general laws and say, you'll notice that the first line about the incorporation or the creation of the MBTA is that it's an government political instrumentality of the Commonwealth. So, we're a part of that fabric of the government that serves people. And I think that what I tried to remind people when I was in charge over there was that our customers are your constituents. They're the same people, and that we're both interested in trying to make sure that their lives are better, that they can get around, that they can get to work, that they can get to visit their family, and they can do that, safely and reliably, and so on. And so I think that there's a tremendous importance that the person who's in the seat of the general manager or on the board, pays strict attention to what's happening, either indirectly as a body through the advisory board or directly, mayor to mayor. In the opening remarks, the mayor of Salem talked about the importance of that station to her city. I can remember, she was mayor when I was GM, and she was a fierce advocate for making sure that the station was not just clean every day, but also that there were improvements made, because the benefit to the city was beyond even the service of transportation. It was a catalyst for economic development. And so I can just remember, again, speaking back to my own experiences, I think that the good part of the politics, not the bad stuff, that my colleagues have mentioned, which I totally agree, keep the, cronyism, hiring, and that kind of stuff away. But some of my most fruitful conversations were, with the mayors of some of the key cities that we served. And the last thing I'll say is, it's totally self-interested to go to Fred's point about getting adequate resources and attention. The 175 cities and towns in which we operate, their local elected officials were our advocates with the legislature, because that's where we needed to go to get resources. And so it was certainly within our direct interest to make sure that we had a good rapport and good relationship, and served you as a mayor, as well as we served our mutual customers and constituents.
Great.
And if I could, I would just add one point about the governance, because both Dan and myself served as chair of the board in that structure when we were secretary. The secretary is the direct link to the governor in that form of board. The general manager was chosen by the board, but the other role that the secretary played was to get a real multimodal attitude and get cooperation from the Department of Public Works, Mass Highway, as it was later called, the Port Authority. There's a terrible tendency toward silo thinking. Port Authority loves to get all the access in the world. They keep growing the airport, but heaven forfend, they put some money into providing more access. A little bit unfair. The Logan Express is a good example of where they have stepped up to the plate. But one of the jobs of the secretary as chair was not just working with the T, but making sure there was a cooperative attitude from the highway department and the Port Authority. And it's, I think that's an important role that's too easily forgotten. It's not just about the secretary showing up and chairing a board meeting. It's about what he does outside of that. And when you periodically go to the legislature for bond authorizations for capital investments, creating a balanced package so there are enough benefits, usually on the Chapter 90 and highway side, to the non-MBTA part of the district is essential. It's unrealistic and unfair to expect North Adams to be paying for my bus ride unless there's a balance in it that North Adams has a regional transit agency that's getting a reasonable appropriation and has decent amounts of Chapter 90 money, which they're not getting now. So the secretary's role is a balancing role and an integrating role, in my view, with the to get a truly multimodal attitude. And as Dan said, working with the mayors were, I agree with them, our best advocates to get decent amounts of money into the system.
Thank you.
And I would just add to what Fred said that I don't know, the two, how you want to count them, the 2 or 3 transportation reforms of the early 2000s into today. I think that is one thing that they did right, is that they strengthened the Secretary of Transportation's role within the community, the family of transportation agencies, so that there was more of an attention to what, in connection to mass sport, so that you could be declaring multimodalism. The Turnpike was totally independent, and then that was more folded in. So I think one thing that the transportation reforms absolutely got right was really creating a mass DOT, during the 2000s.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate your honesty sorry, I was on mute. No, I appreciate your honesty on that. I think it's something that I live by here as Mayor Medford. When two of you made the point that you put the best, most qualified people in the positions to be able to, in my case, move the city forward the best way possible for our residents, in this case, for the T and for the riders. So thank you. I'm going to move on. Fred, I'll turn this one over to you first. Give me a minute to read it. But currently the state DPU is the official entity for oversight over the MBTA. This appears to come as a surprise to many, including the DPU itself, which seems underprepared for the role. Should the oversight function remain with the DPU, but be strengthened, be recreated in MassDOT, or be set up as an entity, entirely new entity? If a new entity, what should that look like?
Well, there are multiple questions embedded in that question. The Department of Public Utilities is today in no way adequate to the challenges about to come up that really have been here for a while, but they're just not set up to deal with it. With all the discussion about electrification, providing for charging for electric autos, et cetera, this big push to electrify, go to battery buses at the T. I'll be a little bit radical. I'm against it right now. You don't have adequate power at many of the locations where the maintenance facilities are to fuel it, and you're dealing with an electric utility that doesn't want to provide that power. It's essential that the Department of Public Utilities is dramatically strengthened to play a role with strengthening the grid so that some of the electrification ideas are physically feasible, because a lot of them aren't right now. So the DPU's got big challenges coming up. Certainly, if they were going to be the safety, exercise their responsibilities that they currently legally have, but are not staffed up to do, they would need to staff up to do that as well. One question is, that's a lot of staffing up. Maybe you can do it all. It's something the governor, lieutenant governor have to look at with the legislature very carefully. What is the future role of the DPU and how can that be adequately done? Assuming for the sake of argument that you don't think that doing safety at an adequate level at the same time that you're dramatically increasing the capacity in dealing with the electric grid is the right mix. There is a belief that's embedded in some statutes that the safety function ought to be independent of the T. I would go back to make a safer T, give it an adequate budget. If you don't have adequate frequency and the platforms get overloaded, that's not safe. If the operator can't see down the platform because it's too crowded, that's not safe. If people are falling off the curb because the buses aren't frequent enough and they're falling into the travel way, that's not safe. So adequate capacity is a safety issue. That takes money, but in terms of the governance, you might think about putting it at the advisory board, which cares about housing, cares about safety, cares about service. They would have to gear up. Wherever this is placed, they have to gear up. It's a little awkward to put it within the secretariat, especially if you've got the secretary serving as chairman of the board. It doesn't look very independent to have the safety function under the Secretary of Transportation. I guess there are other places you could put it, but I think there's a big role for expertise here. I would take a hard look at putting it at the advisory board. I know there are other ideas floating around, but it's a big decision to make. But if whoever gets the responsibility, if they don't have the funding to staff up, then you're just setting up a fall guy.
Thank you, Fred. Joe, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. I agree with much what Fred says. It doesn't belong in the Mass DOT. There's too many perceived and real conflicts of interest. And I think the safety function within the DPU is just a lost child. When we did the LaHood chaired safety panel, they were completely non-responsive. Then you get this horrible report that comes out. And then 2 years later, the FTA finds that the DPU is still in the same passive mode and not fulfilling the function that the FTA has asked them to fulfill. So something has got to be, I think, changed. DPU will have a major role around electrification, independent of the safety function, to make sure there's adequacy, redundancy, et cetera, of all those sources of power that the T is going to need. But that can be separated out. This idea of possibly bringing it over to the advisory board is one I had not heard from before, but that would seem to be a place that could have great merit. Fred quietly said you've got to develop the expertise there. It's important to remember you're not going to be able to pay normal state wages to attract the kind of technical expertise who know what they're looking at in the ground, who can read a safety plan, who could read a capital improvement plan or maintenance plan and say, yeah, they're getting it right, they're doing it. Even proactively, Fred sort of referred to, and I know Dan knows this problem, you get to volumes of passengers in certain stations, some of the old parts of the Orange Line, the Red Line right downtown Boston. There's not adequate space for the passengers who are waiting for a train to sort of align themselves. Probably heading to a place where platform doors that you see in airports and you see in European systems are going to be required. That's a place where a really effective state safety oversight enterprise can say to the T, hey, look, you get this current problem that's only going to get worse. How does your capital plan align with this? How does your signal plan align with this, et cetera? So for whoever's going to get this, I would just say, you're going to have to recognize that your salary structure is going to have to be more akin to an MWRA, a Massport salary structure, because you need that expertise. Doesn't need to be the biggest organization, part of the organization in the world. But you're really going to need to pay people to get the right people and keep them there so they can be effective.
Thank you, Joe. Dan, I'll turn this one over to you.
Yeah, I think Joe's spot on, and both he and Fred identified, and I wholeheartedly concur that first and foremost, you have to have adequate funding, adequate staffing, and the appropriate level of expertise. Yeah. If you want really good safety oversight, the MBTA is a complicated organization. It is itself multimodal, from worrying about from trolleys to heavy rail to ferry systems to, I mean, elevators, escalators. There's a lot that can go wrong from a safety perspective in a very old system to boot. So you really need to make sure that wherever ultimately, I guess the legislature decides to place this responsibility, that they are funded and that the expertise is really spelled out. The second thing is independence, and I guess this speaks to the point that both Fred and Joe mentioned, which is under the current structure, I'd agree that Mass DOT would be not the good place to put it, because again, it'd be inherent. You can't have the watchdog hired by the person who's supposed to watch. You're supposed to be watching you. So that doesn't seem to me to be right. I think that's why it's placed at DPU, in a different location. The challenge is that as an instrumentality of the state, there's not a lot of other places right now. I guess you could sort of easily go. Brian Koehn asked me to talk about my own experience in Honolulu. So the system that I ran in Honolulu, or the agency that I ran, was an instrumentality of the city and the county of Honolulu. And in that case, HIDOT, Hawaii DOT, was the place where the safety oversight was located. And that was appropriate because it was separated. The governor appointed those folks and they oversaw what we did. And I reported to a board and to a mayor, and to a city council. So yeah, I don't know whether it be the advisory board, whether it be, an inspector general or auditor, some other, place within government that would be viewed as strong but independent. Maybe that's the kind of thing you want to look at. Or if it stayed at somewhere like a DPU, and again, I'm just sort of spitballing here, is there a way to give a term of office or something like that, like you do for the inspector general, that gives them the independence from whoever the governor is, or even who the commissioners are at DPU, so that they can make, but sometimes it's going to be an embarrassing call, right? I mean, if you find something that's not right and you call it out, that's what we're all really dancing around here, is how do you make sure that the people who need to tell the truth can feel that they can do that without, the interference of politics. And so I just say adequate funding, technical expertise, and then strive to find that locus of independence and give them the strength to do it.
Great. Thank you, Dan. I know we have a few more minutes. I don't know if you have anything to add, since we have the advisory board on the call listening in, as well as the executive branch of the MBTA, before we close out and hand it back over to Brian. With your expertise, I just want to give you that opportunity.
Well, I would just make another pitch for a strengthened role for the advisory board. If the safety function were going to be added, one advantage is there already is expertise, and this would strengthen the expertise, but the link to the budget process that I think should be stronger, if you could add as well as delete. If you were going to do something like Joe suggests, platform screen doors, if you think about the Park Street southbound platform, half of the people are going to Ashmont, or less than half, more than half are going to Braintree. So there's always people left on the platform because they're waiting for the next train. Very difficult for the operator to see that whole platform. And that's a place, if you were going to do a gradual introduction of platform screen doors, you'd want to do it Park Street first. And you got to resist the temptation to say, well, that's not fair. Let's have it here, 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 and everywhere. If from a safety point of view, the right thing to do is to start at Park Street, the advisory board had a stronger budget role that would establish the link to the money to actually implement an idea like that, to say, it's got to be prioritized to do Park Street first. Eventually, we might want all the stations, but we're going to start at the ones that are most critical. And you'd be able to have some discipline about the safety function with the connection to the appropriation process, if you strengthen that appropriation process.
Great. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, I would also agree, both Dan and Fred, stronger role for the advisory board. you know, a galaxy away many, many years ago, or whatever that phrase is, I was Assistant General Manager for Budget and Planning. And when Ann Lanner of the advisory board came walking down the hall, you sort of ran away into the bathroom because the advisory board was really this powerhouse with good authority. And I think it was a remarkable governor on sort of how we behaved and what we did and what we prioritized. I'm absolutely for that.
Yeah, I would say that's, again, the model that I lived through. Yeah, you listened, you heeded the advisory board, and the advisory board, you know, spoke for the cities and towns as a collective body, and I think that was important. Again, not only to give direction to the board and to the general manager about priorities, but also ultimately to also help us to make our case when we needed something. The only thing I'd add is we've talked a lot about each of the different kind of key players of the board, the general manager, the governor. I would just also, you know, say that an active legislative oversight is critical. When I was in both of my positions, we were fortunate to have very strong House and Senate leadership in the transportation committees. They also were very active, not, you know, really on a regular basis. They communicated with me about their priorities, and again, critically important to Fred's point, if we're going to win the legislature over, your first advocates are your legislative oversight committee chairs to go to their leadership and to the rest of the bodies to say, we really need to, you know, do something difficult here, which is to come up with more money and decide that money's going to go here versus someplace else. So, you know, I applaud the legislative leaders, the chairs who are, you know, actively engaged in seeing what's happening here and engaged with what's happening with the T. I think that's also very critical. This is absolutely a classic. It takes a village to create a successful MBTA. There is no one group or one entity. So I think all of these folks in all of these different organizations and entities are really critical.
Absolutely. It does take a village, and we appreciate your expertise to help start that change and make it the best that we can with the MBTA. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate being part of this, and I look forward to the rest of the panelists, as well as Mayor Ballantyne, who I know is on the call. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thanks very much. And thanks so much to Fred, Dan, and Joe, three former board chairs of the MBTA, as well as many other hats that you've worn over the years. So thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate your expertise. Madam Mayor, thank you for all you do, not just for Medford, but as I said to Mayor Driscoll, for the entire region. Mayors of our cities, especially in the inner core, don't just communicate and run their own communities. There's lots of regionality and lots of discussions going on across borders. So thank you for all you do and for your service on the advisory board.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So as we transition to panel two, I just wanted to take a minute to say and welcome all of the other MBTA advisory board members who are here, including a few mayors, several select board chairs, as well as their designees. These are the folks that work with me on a daily basis and work together to make a better MBTA. And I also just wanted to thank the remaining nearly 160 participants who are here today. This is a number that is much larger than I certainly thought we would have. And I'm grateful that everyone is here. And I also wanted to thank the members of the legislature who are here with us from the state Senate and the state House, as well as the many legislative staffers who have joined us. So we appreciate all that you do for the MBTA, for cities and towns, and for our communities. I am honored to introduce another MBTA advisory board member, Heather Hamilton. Heather is the chair of the Town of Brookline Select Board in the executive body of the largest town in New England, and I stress the word town there. She holds 2 master's degrees, one in transportation policy and another in public administration. And she is serving in her second term as board chair in her 5th year on the Board of Selectmen in total, which I can assure you is no mean feat. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Heather, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much, Brian. I am very delighted to help moderate this exciting panel on funding the T. First, I want to give introductions to our panelists. We have Senator Brandon Crighton. He is the Democratic State Senator from the 3rd Essex District, consisting of the city of Lynn and the towns of Linfield, Marblehead, Nahant, Saugus, Swampscott in the county of Essex. He is also the chairperson of the Joint Committee on Transportation, our favorite committee. Prior to becoming a state senator in 2018, he was a state rep from 2015 onwards. From 2005 to 2015, he worked in the office of State Senator Thomas McGee, spending 5 years as a legislative aide and 5 as chief of staff. Ward 5 Lynn City Councilor from 2010 to 2014, and also served as Lynn City Councilor at large from 2014 to 2016. Next, we have Tim Murray, President and CEO of the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce since 2013. He was also Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts from 2007 to 2013 when I worked at MassDOT. And finally, he was mayor of Worcester from 2002 to 2007. And last but not least, Andy Bagley. He is the Vice President for Policy and Research at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. Previously, Andy was the Deputy Secretary and Executive Director of the Massachusetts Office of International Trade in the 2nd Dukakis administration. He was former staff member to U.S. Senator Paul Tsongas. And prior to that, he worked as an environmental economist at GCA Technology. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Let me start with the first question. Is the current financing structure the right one to sustain the T? What percentage of their funding do you feel is appropriate to come from fares, and how much from state or local coffers? Is a free or reduced fare structure a viable component of a future financing plan? Let's start with Andy.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation being here. I've learned over the many years that you're rarely wrong when you say what Fred said. No, we never fixed the dedicated funding for the MBTA. This goes back, current funding structure goes back to 2000, Blue Ribbon Committee that was looking to develop a sustainable dedicated revenue source for the MBTA, turned to the state sales tax revenues that would be transferred to the T as a pre-budget, so it didn't have to be appropriated. The analysis showed that in the previous decade, sales tax revenues were growing 5 to 7% a year. So that committee felt there was ample revenue source to supply the T with the needed revenues. The problem was that from about 2000 to 2010, sales tax revenues grew at about 1% a year. The T did not get anywhere near the amount of money that they forecast, at least from the state on this dedicated revenue structure. And that led the T to having to do a number of things that they probably would have preferred not to do, such as cutting the capital budget so that their debt service costs were low because they couldn't afford it in the operating budget, or securitizing their parking revenues to close budget gaps. Local finance, the money is contributed by the municipalities, is statutory set up to be 2.5% or lower, depending upon inflation. And so that traditionally has been growing about 1%. So there's not any real revenue growth there. And so what you had really left were fare hikes. And fare hikes are so unpopular that we would see 5 to 7 years transpire before there was an agreement on a fare hike. And some of those were substantial. I think the one in 2009 or 10 was around 25% or so, but enough to really significantly create a needed revenue stream for the T, but extraordinarily unpopular. And so later on, I think about 5, 6 years ago, we changed the statute to say fare hikes were limited to 7% once every 24 months. So try to tie it to inflation. MTF released a report, a very detailed report in 2015 called The T, The End of Its Line. It was about the T had become a ward of the state, both its operating budget and its capital budget. And what we were seeing was a very simple, mathematical equation. Expenses at the MBTA were growing at twice the rate of revenues. And so what has transpired since the Fiscal and Management Control Board are enormous amounts of really important substantive changes, but that funding structure remains in place. And so if you're looking at the current pro forma for the next 5 years, the T will update this in about another month. But we're looking at a operating budget gap of approximately 200 to 250 million in fiscal 24. That'll be contingent on how many people they can hire of the 2,000 the FDA is telling them to. And that quickly grows to about 500 million in FY 26. And that gap is driven principally because expenses are growing twice that of revenues. Fare revenues are the one place where you can see growth in the past, particularly with fare hikes and more people riding. But due to COVID, I don't think fare revenues will return to where they were in 2019. They used to supply, let me just wrap it up here. Before the pandemic, fare revenues accounted for about a third of MBTA expenses. That dropped to 10% and is now projected to be around 20%. So that gap of where it was before the pandemic and where it is now is substantial. We've had federal money to backfill. We had 2 really great years of state tax revenues that have jumped up that sales tax money that goes to the T pre-budget, but that's unlikely to continue. So we are looking at some significant operating budget gaps over the next 3 to 4 years.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that sobering reality check. State Senator or former Lieutenant Governor, either of you want to weigh in?
Defer to Tim. Go get him.
I'll defer to you as the chair.
No, I mean, Andy obviously is an expert in the space, and I appreciate his work and Mass Taxpayers. Going back to my time working for then Senator McGee, who was the chairman of transportation when we looked to tackle this in 2012 and 2013, and a lot of that was based off of some of the evidence that Angie just laid out from 2000, the early 2000s. Obviously, the finance report that came out that raised alarms in terms of what we needed just to maintain operations in a state of good repair, how much more revenue is needed. I come into this role at a time where we're emerging from the pandemic. Obviously we had some discussions around revenue in the legislature just shortly prior to, and then the House had moved forward, and then the pandemic hit, and it really was not appropriate for, I think, the Senate to dive into long-term revenue discussions at a time where we didn't know what we were facing. The uncertainty, I think, was too great for the Commonwealth at that time. But it's fair to say now that we have to have this conversation for all the reasons that Andy just highlighted in terms of the revenue projections. I'm of the mindset, and I'm just one of 200 members, and as chairman of transportation, I get to bring folks together on transpo. But this is just my view is that we can't do it on the backs of the riders. Raising fares at this point would hurt some of the most needy in our Commonwealth at a time when we're trying to bring riders back into the system. I am supportive of means tested fares, which the legislature has been on record a few times on, and I plan on pursuing, as we look at revenue and other things, that this needs to be something that's part of it. I'm from the community of Lynn, and we're not alone, but to get from Lynn to Boston right now, our main option is the commuter rail, and that's a $7 one-way trip. That is not something even my middle class constituents can afford. And I certainly think if we're going to build ridership and build a transportation system that works for all of us, that we can't continue to hike fares. So I hate to say I'm excited to have the hard conversation, but we need to have this conversation in the upcoming session, both around, God willing, the fair share amendment passes and there is revenue coming there, but also longer term dedicated revenues, not only to the MBTA, but any of our public transit agencies, to the RTAs as well, to make sure that we have, regional equity in mind for those folks that are outside of this service area. So I'm excited. In the transportation bond bill, we had created a mobility pricing commission that's going to look at a number of different models, help prepare us. In the meantime, I know the business community and other experts in the transportation space are, convening meetings and continuing to have this conversation. But anyways, I'm excited to work with all of you, the advisory board certainly, and also the experts on this panel, the previous panel, and anyone else that could help us move the ball forward for a dedicated revenue stream.
Thank you. So former Lieutenant Governor, maybe I'll pitch this next question to you. Should the state take on more of the T's capital debt to give the authority more budget flexibility?
Yes, without a doubt. And let me just say, listening to Mayor Koch and Mayor Driscoll, I'm very encouraged that we're seeing, more municipal leaders in this conversation, and having someone like Senator Crighton, who, through his work with Senator McGee as a Lynn City Council, also brings kind of a on the ground perspective to this conversation. But, I'll go back to, in our administration and doing a little research for this panel, having some flashbacks to a couple of our attempts to address these issues. And I go back to 2013, Governor Patrick said, "It's as plain as day we have choices to make. We can choose to invest in ourselves, to invest in a growth strategy that has proven time and again to work, or we can choose to do nothing. But let's be clear and honest with each other. Choosing to do nothing is a choice too. And that choice has consequences. I would only add that choosing half steps has consequences as well. And there were moments and opportunities in 2009 and 2013 to address these revenue shortfalls and address something that predates what Andy talked about in 2000, but the debt that has been saddled with the MBTA and cannibalize a lot of the operating budget. And I'll leave it to the Senator and the in this unique moment that the new administration and the legislature will have in January. But we've got to do this right and thoroughly. And a major piece of that, what the financing structure looks like. Senator and the legislature be better versed in that. But I think we absolutely can do some things in the short term to relieve that debt, which would free up money for the operating budget so that we can hire and do training. Former Secretary of Transportation Aloisi, I thought, came up with a very thoughtful piece earlier this month that talks about that. But I would just urge the new administration and legislature. Harry Truman said, the only thing that's new in this world is the history you don't know. And if we look at the history of the last 25 years, if we do this, if we half-step this, we're going to be coming back and continue to have this conversation. There's a unique moment. Let's get the financing right with probably some type of blend. Maybe in the intervening time, we can do some pilots on free fare to really understand that. But we clearly need to get rid of that debt and come up with a financing plan that makes sense. And municipalities should have skin in the game, especially if they're going to have a seat at the table.
Absolutely. Andy, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Well, to me, the debt service cost is really a tactic that works probably as well as new revenues. I mean, if you're either shifting more money to the T or you're absorbing some of their ongoing costs. Their debt service costs right now are around 550 million. So that's not insignificant. If they could free up a portion of that, I think Jim Aloisi was talking about maybe half, but whatever that number is, that is something that would be great if the state could absorb it. So that all makes sense. I guess my concern is that whatever sources of revenue need to be two things. They need to be dedicated, and they also need to be able to grow at least a 3% rate. We're asking the T, which has gone through years of budget cutting and reduced personnel headcounts, to hire 2,000 more people, which is going to run 150 million a year. They're going to start fully operating South Coast Rail and the Green Line extension, which is going to cost 30-40 mil per year in operating expenses. So their costs are going to be really difficult to control at below 4% to do all the things the FTA is going to ask them, and then to take on an awful lot of the projects and the issues that the legislature, advocates, anybody who supports transportation would like them to do. And then one other point I'd like to make is we're only talking about the operating budget. The T has a huge financial cliff on the capital budget side. They put out a capital needs assessment last June. They'll be updating that this November. I'm looking forward to seeing the new numbers. But the old numbers suggest that over the next 10 years, they need to spend about $25 to $27 billion, and they only have about half of that. So they're about $13 billion short. That's for the existing system. That's no expansions. That's just the current system. And that number is likely to grow because it didn't have any real figures on climate resiliency and redundancy for their infrastructure. So when that comes out, the point we've been making for the last couple of years is, yes, the operating budget is going to be a huge problem, but the capital budget is as well. And so we're going to need rigorous support from across the board, business community, legislators, to be able to support the vision that people want this transit system to be able to deliver.
Thank you. That actually kind of leads into my next question. What role should municipalities and organizations such as the MBTA's advisory board have in overseeing the T? And maybe another way of framing it is, how can we help? State Senator, would you like to be the first one to try to attempt to answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think the board can play a big role. They have played a big role. There's no question that it's essential to ensuring accountability at the T, raising the voices of local leaders in the 176 MBTA communities for all of these issues that we raised here today, both operating and capital. So hopefully I'll be chair next session and look forward to working directly with you. I think it's a big role. And to Andy's point, we really have to raise these issues that everyone's just trying to get through their daily lives. I mean, there are many challenges that families face every day. They don't have the time to read every report that comes out, to keep up with every MBTA, control board or board meeting these days, or our oversight hearing. So how do we get the message out there, how big of an impact transportation has on everyday lives, all of us, whether you ride public transit or not, and what the challenges that we're facing. I just came from a Chamber of Commerce discussion. It was a great discussion, but one of the speakers had just talked about how flush with cash we are as a state. And yes, revenues have come in higher than expected. Obviously, we're giving a lot of that back, but a lot of the issues are that led to that, both the federal one-time federal sources and really a unique and strange economy at the moment, aren't going to be here long term. So we need to get the message out there that yes, at the moment things are going well. Longer term, we have serious challenges, and if I mean, just picture a world where the T obviously needs to be operating at a higher level, but if it was not operating at all, we'd be at a standstill. The economy would be at a standstill. People wouldn't be able to get through their daily activities, picking up kids from school, or going to doctor's appointments, and getting folks to realize how it impacts them whether or not they use transit. This is a public good and one that we need to invest in. So I believe that the board's role continues to help elevate those issues, elevate the voices of community members on the ground level. And I look forward to partnering with you in this next session.
Excellent. Former Lieutenant Governor, do you have any thoughts on how municipalities or the Chamber of Commerce, not just yours, but the many ones in Massachusetts can try to help the team?
Well, I would just, say some of the numbers that Andy can throws out there, are daunting, and we've got to be clear-eyed about it. But, at the same time, I think Mayor Koch and Quincy can talk about it. Certainly in Salem, Worcester, people talk about the transformation and the economic momentum in Worcester over the last 20 years. Well, a big piece of that has been the investments that have taken place in expansion of commuter rail, in our WRTA infrastructure. And so that creates economic opportunity. So we also think about economic justice, environmental justice. These investments facilitate all of that. So if we can open that up to more parts of the state, hopefully we create those surpluses with more regions of the state contributing and opening up the state. So there is this moment, I do believe, given, as the senator talked about, the ARPA money, the state surpluses, the federal infrastructure bill, for us to do this in a way, it's not painless, but that's forward thinking, that we create sustainable revenue. So as the senator mentioned, we are facilitating a public good that addresses so many other issues that we often talk about in the public policy realm. And, local and regional chambers across the state understand this issue. And we're seeing some of that conversation in the South Coast now, and economic development that's taking place in anticipation of the rail that is be coming soon. So the numbers are challenging. We've got to be clear-eyed about it, but we also have a chance to mitigate some of that with these federal dollars that are before us and the state surplus.
Thank you. Andy, you look like you're chomping at the bit.
So one of the things we've been paying attention to quite closely are during the pandemic and sort of a post-pandemic recovery, where we're seeing far greater flexibility in working from home or working from anywhere, and looking at the census data of migration, we're seeing a lot of migration out, leaving Massachusetts, 46,000 last year net, whereas the other 5 New England states all had positive growth, which I've never seen before. And I think what's concerning us is the high cost of living, it's housing, it's congestion, it's childcare, it's the commute, it's all those things. If you don't have a well-running, efficient, reliable public transit system, people are just not going to get back in their cars and drive into Boston every day for a job. It's when they can relocate other places. We're already seeing that. So we feel that investment in public transit is critical for the long-term competitiveness of the state, and not just the T, but obviously the RTAs and public transit across the Commonwealth, because people are leaving Massachusetts and moving to other places, other regions within Massachusetts, as well as leaving. So with that said, I think one of the things I would say that the advisory board could do, and we obviously would want to be a part of that conversation, bringing the business community. If we don't have a public discussion about these needs in 2023, then the numbers are going to emerge and decisions are going to be made predicated on the resources that are available, and that's not going to be optimum. So while I agree with the potential optimism and that these investments repay, we're going to have to talk about this fairly soon, or we're going to find out that people just don't want to use our transportation system to live here.
Very good point. I'll just share a personal anecdote. I moved here in 2011 up from Washington, D.C., grew up in Portland, Maine. And I was late by 45 minutes at least once a week when I lived in D.C., because that train system was just no bueno. And so I'm one of the very few who is a diehard Green Line fan. I love it. I think it's great, even when I have to wait 3 trains in the morning. But I feel like I'm in the minority on that. I also kind of feel like a Red Sox fan this year, where it's like, okay, we're in a rebuilding period. But I definitely want to see the T succeed, because I chose to live here without having a car, so that I could use public transit to get where I wanted to go. And it's just been really delightful. There have definitely been some times where it has not been pleasant, but I do feel like a lot of people take the T for granted because they have not lived elsewhere to see what it's like in other places. Now, if you compare us to New York or European transit systems, or even Hong Kong, but they invested. And that's, for me, one of the big differences. So let's move into our last scheduled question. Previously, the advisory board had a line item veto authority over the budget. What was taken away by the legislature in 2009? Should that power be restored? What role do you see the board playing in finances going forward? Andy, do you want to take that question?
I probably know this subject the least of my peers. But listening to Joe and Fred and Dan in the last segment, I understand the power and the logic behind it. My only caution at this point would be, you've got a Federal Transit Administration that has interceded and will be around for another year or 2 or 3. It took them a number of years down in WMATA. They are going to have input in changes in both the operating and capital budgets, predicated on the priorities that they've established in the safety requirements. So as long as we understand that the FTA, which holds out the potential of withholding federal funds if we do not make progress on a number of the safety and the liability issues, as long as we understand they're going to dictate much of this, at least at the outset. I think we should consider how to bring the advisory board back in as an invested player.
That sounds pretty well informed to me. Lieutenant Governor, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think the previous panel similarly, talked about the pros and cons of some of the various structures, and can you learn from each of the, scenarios that we've seen over the last 25 or 30 years and kind of come up with a new model. And again, I thought the Secretary Aloisi's kind of proposal that he put out there earlier this month, might address some of those things, giving the MBTA board, some autonomy, but also having gubernatorial input. His proposal had, I think, a 7-member board, 3 appointed by the governor, including the Secretary of Transportation. Also then having the MBTA advisory board playing a role with 2 municipal leaders, and 1 from Boston, and a 7. So I thought, that might be a good framework to build a discussion around in terms of the governance. And I think Andy's right. We've seen both Secretary LaHood come in at the request of the Financial Management Control Board, and then most recently, in light of the safety issues and breakdowns, they're going to have a role to play in this. So clearly, people like Senator Crighton and the incoming administration and the House, chair, continues to be Chairman Strauss, will have to interface with the feds in that process. But I do think, and just to go back on the financing piece, as I think as the senator and others look at this, if communities are benefiting from MBTA service and others, how do you look at ways of revenue recapture things? I mean, you got to think outside the box, but I do think that there's this moment to maybe come up with a comprehensive package that can really move the system forward and continue to have strategic expansion as well.
Excellent. State Senator?
Hey, just to quickly build off what Tim had said, I do agree it needs to be a comprehensive package, right? I don't think there's any one silver bullet here. So certainly keeping everything on the table. In terms of the veto authority, I'm not going to fully punt on this one, but I had not been in the transportation space in 2009. I think Tom became chair the year after. So I need to go back, see what the rationale was there, talk to the board, get better educated on it. Obviously, the committee is going to want to take a look at a number of reforms and ways that we can improve the system. And certainly we want to have that conversation with you and other stakeholders. So I guess my answer is to be continued. Hopefully next session we'll have a better thought out response from me.
Excellent. So I have to buy some time. So I have two questions. We'll start with the more serious question first, and then the fun question, hopefully, for last. Do you think that the T has expanded too much, too fast? So has the T grown too much? And should future expansion plans be shelved to allow us to focus on what we have now?
Well, I would say it depends on where you're sitting. I think there's a number of regions of the state that said that is not expanded fast enough, and at the detriment from an economic, environmental perspective to those regions. And we oftentimes think of MBTA, a very Boston centric entity. So if we're going to talk about things of equity and we need to also think of regions throughout the state. And that's where I think the regional transit authorities have to be, and I know will be, an important part of this conversation, because they play roles in each one of the regions that those regional transit authorities serve are all a little bit different. You don't have the density, the complementary systems that the MBTA kind of has in the greater Boston area. So that is vital to discussion. And I think, strategic expansion has to be one of the priorities, through this. And again, you've got a federal infrastructure bill that we need to fully leverage. Massachusetts is a donor state. We pay more into the federal government than we receive back. And so we, should be very aggressive partnering with our federal delegation when we're submitting proposals for expansion for infrastructure, that Massachusetts is getting its fair share. And I hope and expect that the federal delegation will be, vigorously engaged in that process.
I agree with Tim there. I mean, I think this is a once in a generation opportunity to seize on these federal dollars. Safety must be the top priority. We're tackling that now. We're working with this administration in the next to make sure that folks can know that they have a safe system to get on as a bare minimum. But as Tim said, I mean, across the state, you go out to Western Massachusetts, really just transportation deserts out there. We need to think in terms of regional equity. We need to make sure that we're investing in expanding in a way that helps everyone, but also even closer to the core. I mean, I'm in Lynn. We've been promised a Blue Line extension for over 100 years. We're 12 miles from Boston. I can see it right around the corner from my house, but it takes me over an hour to get in every day. The traffic has already crawled back to what it was pre-pandemic. So I think we need to look at strategic again. I'm not saying just expand the system everywhere, but there's obviously a need to rid ourselves of these old diesel commuter rail locomotives that we have, to electrify the system. And that needs to start in environmental justice communities like Chelsea, Revere, Everett, Lynn, Salem, all along the line that could really be taken care of pretty quickly with a much better return on investment when you look at the reliability of these lightweight electric vehicles, not to mention the public health benefits, meeting our emissions goals. So there's smart ways to do it. I think we need to be selective and not to just to say, expansion to Lynn is the only one that should be there, but you need to start somewhere in electrification. So Fairmont and the environmental justice corridor that comes up through my way, I think is a no-brainer. And I hope that we can see some of these federal dollars to make those projects a reality.
Andy, before I call on you, I'm going to throw out an analogy, and I'd love to get your opinion on whether or not you think it's an accurate analogy or not. A lot of people get very nervous when the stock market starts to retract, and some people say that's the perfect time to jump in. You really should be looking at a portfolio over 30 years, not 5 years, depending on where you are in your career. Does that kind of apply here? Should we not be so scared about what's going on in the near term that we forget that this is a very long-term investment?
It is hard to disagree with the comments made by my two peers on this panel. I think the vision is an excellent vision. That's exactly what one would hope for an economy that's continuing to grow, to expand, and to create more equity. All of those things are incredibly important. And I would agree with you that you really do need to think about where do you want to be 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, because you need to plan for those investments, and you need to plan how you're going to finance them, how you're going to have the capacity to build them. All of that makes perfect sense. You happen to have an immediate crisis with your current system that the FTA, I don't think, could have been more stark in what they are telling us about the condition of the existing T. That has to be fixed. If your core system does not work, then all of the expansions are not going to do much for economic growth. So it is a big package. But let me go back to your reference about following the Red Sox. It better be a very good off season, right? I mean, that's where we're looking. We know that team needs to have a really good off season if next year is going to be good. I'm suggesting that all of the visions that from Jim Aloisi, et cetera, which I totally understand and cannot disagree with, we need to put that all on the table and have a really strong off season while the next administration comes in and starts dealing with these realities. So yes, can we do it all? If we're careful, if we're thoughtful, but if we don't take care of the existing system in the next couple of years, we're going to be in a completely different place.
Thank you. So now the fun question. What is your either earliest memory of the T or your most fun memory of the T? I still remember tokens.
That was easy.
Yeah. Andy, do you have a memory of the T?
I did not grow up in Boston. I moved here in '74 after college, but my father and my aunt both were born here. And I remember coming up in the late 50s and in the 60s to go into Fenway Park, taking the T. And just, my time was seeing the Red Sox and Ted Williams, and I never thought about whether we'd be able to get there or get back.
Well, I have two quick ones. I think certainly one of the first would be taking the commuter rail shortly after it was introduced to Worcester to Boston. We only had 6 round trips daily back with, I think, Governor Salvucci. And then but prior to that, driving into with my dad and probably some of my brothers, younger brothers, in the station wagon and parking somewhere and getting on the Green Line. I think it was or one of the trolleys to get into town. So that was something I remember back way back in the Wayback Machine.
State Senator?
Yeah, it might sound cheesy. I remember just getting my job at the State House. I never really had much of a reason to take the T in. Otherwise, maybe a Red Sox game here or there. I didn't have a car at the time. My grandfather would drop me off, almost run through every red light on the way into Revere, and I'd have to remind Papa, there's a red light, red light, red light, red light, and then you slam on the brakes. And if I made it to the Blue Line live, I could take a brief nap or listen to some music before walking up Bowdoin and seeing the Golden Dome. And At the time, I didn't know much about state government, but just being in like awe, just absolute awe of how cool it was to have that opportunity to work for Tom McGee and to be in that building. So it was, yeah, that's probably my favorite memory.
That's a great memory. Well, that's all we have for our panel here today. I'm going to thank all of our panelists. Thank you so much to former Lieutenant Governor Tim Murray, State Senator Brandon Crighton, and Andy from the Mass Taxpayers Association. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Chair Hamilton. Appreciate it. Lieutenant Governor, congrats on the hourly train service to Worcester that I know you're instrumental in getting back, I should say. Thank you. And Senator, I wish you well, drafting what will undoubtedly be a very comprehensive and difficult bill. Andy, I have been a big fan of your work for many years at the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and I'm very grateful for what you do, and I know you will. Please keep it going. Thank you. And as I said, Heather Hamilton, as chair of the Brookline Select Board, I think you have one of the toughest jobs in town government in Massachusetts, and we're very grateful for what you do. I wanted to just talk very briefly about the MBTA Advisory Board as we're just waiting for one final panelist to join us in a moment. The Advisory Board, for folks that aren't aware, is the voice of riders via the cities and towns of there's 176 cities and towns in the MBTA service district. The district ranges from Bourne at the Cape Cod Canal all the way out past Fitchburg, and from Amesbury, Salisbury in the northeast is down to the Rhode Island border. In the west, we take in almost all of Worcester County and almost all of central and eastern Massachusetts, and that is about 75% of the state's population. And these are all areas where the MBTA either runs or abut communities that have service. So it is a large area, an area that we've been trying to coordinate municipal leaders on for a long time, and Zoom has been very helpful in recent years in getting folks together more easily without having to travel into Boston from all over the Commonwealth, and we're very grateful for that that ability to do this on Zoom. And if I could put a shameless plug in, we're hoping that this will be allowed to continue, not just for groups like the advisory board, but other municipal groups that try to get together, and just to make it easier to bring folks together would be great. So we are waiting on Mayor Ballantyne. She'll be here in a moment, but in the meantime, I will introduce our third panel, which we're very grateful for them to be here. I can start. Well, actually, you know what? Let me do this instead. Let me turn it over to Mayor Tom Koch, who I introduced earlier, and he can do the introductions of the third panel. Mayor Koch.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a great morning so far. A lot of great thoughts, a lot of great insights. Certainly look forward to discussion with this panel. And as we wait for Madam Mayor, I do want to acknowledge panelist Chris Dempsey, who I came to know this year more personally, but certainly respected his tenure in various roles. Certainly was a candidate for state auditor this year. He's director of the group called Transportation for Massachusetts from 2017 to 21. He spent time as deputy chief of staff and special assistant to the Secretary of Transportation, and then assistant secretary of Transportation, and he was director of innovation from 2007 to 2010. So, Chris, welcome. Glad you're with us. We have Joshua Franklin Hodge, who is the chief of streets for the city of Boston, executive director of the Open Mobility Foundation, Carly, an active member of the Livable Street Alliance, which no surprise being the chief of streets. Previously served as Boston's chief information office from 2014 to 18, and has been a visiting fellow at the Harvard School focused on mobility, technology, and public policy. Thanks for joining us. And then we have Professor Ted Landsmark, director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, regional policy, I should say. Actually, I saw Governor Dukakis at an event on Sunday, and he's amazing, still doing quite well. He was Mayor Walsh's first appointment to the Boston Planning and Development Agency's Board of Directors, first African-American on the MBTA board appointed by Governor Dukakis, and Secretary Salvucci, who we heard from today. Longtime civil rights and equity advocate, and Professor, we're glad you're with us. Brian, has the mayor joined us yet?
Not just yet, sir, but any moment.
Okay, we'll just wait. We are 2 minutes ahead, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes until Madam Mayor joins us. This was radio, this would not be good.
It's not great TV either.
Well, you know what, why don't I just give a little bit of the mayor's bio. Obviously, the mayor of Somerville, elected in 2021. She's the daughter of two immigrant parents from Greece, elected to the Somerville City Council in 2013. twice elected as the council president. And she was involved, very active in the Mystic View Task Force and the Somerville Transportation Equity Partnership and a number of community groups. And her advocacy was helpful in the planning and in the extension of the Green Line and work on the Orange Line. So we certainly thank her for her commitment to Somerville and the greater Boston area. And when she arrives, gentlemen, we're going to be, we got 3 questions to work through.
She is here, sir.
Beautiful. Welcome, Madam Mayor. Okay, well, Madam Mayor, we went over your bio before you joined us, so we're going to get started. And I know this is the last panel, and we'll probably try to keep this thing on time. We have 3 questions, and the first question we have, and I guess we'll go by how I introduced you guys and Madam Mayor. So the first question is really about the growth of the T over the last several years. Has it been too much? We couldn't handle it, or is it too little? And then second to that would be, should future expansion plans be shelved until we get the house in order operationally and what we currently have? So Chris, you wanna lead off on that?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Mayor. It's great to be a part of this distinguished panel and appreciate the MBTA Advisory Board pulling us all together today. It's wonderful to have such a great turnout. And I really enjoyed the conversations that we heard earlier in today's conversation with leaders past, present, and future of our transportation system here in Massachusetts. I am not someone that says that we should be freezing expansion projects at the MBTA, but I do think that we need to be cautious, and we need to understand that there is always going to be that pull for expansion, that it's easy to get excited about a shiny rail extension or a new station that could be created, but that every time we do that, we risk taking our eye off the ball for some of the core functions of the system on a day-to-day basis. I very much appreciate that we need to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. So I still think it's smart to look at targeted expansions where they make sense. But we have to be thinking always, what are we trying to really achieve with the MBTA? Is it a system that's meant to move people efficiently and safely through Eastern Massachusetts? Is it meant to take cars off the road? Is it meant to provide basic mobility for people who can't afford personal vehicles? Is it meant to provide transportation for 9-to-5 commuters? Is it meant to reduce transportation emissions or address some of the inequities that we have? Senator Crighton raised those consistently and with good reason around environmental justice corridors. I'm not sure that it's doing any of those jobs very well today. And if it's not doing those jobs well today, we have to be careful and cautious about asking it to do even more when it's not getting the basic job done.
Thank you, Chris. Josh, you want to repeat the question, or you have a good understanding?
No, I think I have a good understanding, and
Floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'll echo Chris's thanks for you, Mr. Mayor, for moderating this, and for the advisory board for pulling us all together here today. So I think it's helpful to kind of ask what we mean when we talk about expanding the T, because the way that I look at it is not purely through this question of transportation. And, Chris gave a great list of some of the transportation functions of the T, but I view the T as a crucial part of the expansion of our economy. I view it as essential to the growth of our population. I view it as essential to the growth of business and as essential to the growth of economic opportunity in the region. And I think through that lens, we have to, as Chris said, this is about walking and chewing gum, right? Without a doubt, we need to have a system that is more reliable, that delivers on the frequency promises that have been made, that is safe, that people can trust will get them where they need to go. But we cannot make the future growth of our region contingent on solving all of those problems before we start to think about what might be ahead. Because the reality is, if we are going to grow as a city and as a region, it must be with public transit at the center. There is no pathway to growth that involves dramatic expansion of the number of automobiles on our roads. We don't have the capacity for it. We are already one of the most congested cities in the country. We pay a tremendous price for that in time, in health, in actual dollar costs. So if we actually aspire to thrive economically, to grow as a region, that means that we have to strategically expand the T alongside our vision for that growth and make some of the crucial missing connections that will allow us to both have our kind of current urban footprint expand, but also to address some of the issues that we're facing around housing unaffordability and expanding the catchment area of the transit system so that it can provide places for people to live and then access the jobs that they need to access. So to me, that really has to be the core of this, is a vision for growth centered on public transit, thoughtfully making those investments in reliability and state of good repair, while also being very clear about the opportunities that exist if we're able to expand the system in new ways and new places.
Thank you. Professor.
The public transit system is the glue that holds our region together. I am a resident of Jamaica Plain, but I've lived in Quincy and I've lived in North Shore communities. And I know that our road system is at or above capacity at this point. And we're simply not in a position to continue to expand the road system. So we've got to do what other significant American cities have done, whether you're talking about Chicago or Washington or Atlanta. And we have to look to the expansion of our public transit system as a way of addressing many of the other issues that we have in the region. And in particular, I'm referring to the access that we need to provide to affordable housing and to the drivers that we need to expand economic development and to bring people together synergistically. The entire population of our region within 128, within 95, is about the same population as the population of Brookline. And it's hard for us to think, despite the dispersion of multiple political jurisdictions, that what we're trying to serve is a population that is significantly smaller than the population of other areas. And without a working public transit system, we can't begin to develop the kinds of educational and employment opportunities that we need to. So from my perspective, there are continuing expansion steps that need to be taken at the same time that we address the core issues, which clearly we're not doing well at this moment.
Thank you, Professor. I think I heard you say Quincy was your favorite place to live, but I'm not sure. Madam Mayor, obviously Somerville has been a recipient of the expansion of the MBTA, and from what I understand, things are going well. So your thoughts?
They are, thank you. I'm going to ask you to repeat the question.
Sure.
If you would, please, just to make sure I'm on target here.
Sure. Essentially, has the T grown too much or too little? And going forward, should we be shelving plans and trying to take care of what we have, or continue to go both tracks?
Great, thanks for the question. So while the FTA report was an important wake-up call for the state and emphasizes the need for us as a Commonwealth to focus on efforts of maintenance and safety, I believe strongly that that's not enough. We need to do two things. As any entity, when you're managing it, you're trying to deliver the best product, the best service to your customers here and now. But if you want to grow, you have to think about the future. And you need to think about how you're going to sustain that. And if we zoom out and the governor is looking at its entity, which is the entire state, you want to try to make sure that you are delivering the best service product to the people who live here now in order for them to be able to grow and move forward. And I think as a state, we need to rewire our thinking around the T and public transit in general. We need to focus on good public transit as a driver of our economy and a benefit for everyone in the region, because it has the potential to touch so many lives in positive ways. It's good for the justices. It's good for economic justice, for the environmental justice, for the racial justice. Massachusetts needs a world-class transit system that's safe, reliable, and affordable. And that world-class vision for the system that understands its role in our economy and the future. We haven't gotten it right yet. As a daily rider of the T, I understand firsthand the importance of safe and reliable T, but I know we can do more. I'm optimistic that we can create a public transit system that riders deserve and that Massachusetts deserves. And I believe it needs to be a priority for the next administration. As I've constantly said since taking office, public transit requires sustained and predictable funding. After all, a big part of what the T looks like in the coming years depends on the priorities of the next administration and how they prioritize federal transportation and infrastructure dollars. Not only how it is spent, but in which communities the money is invested in. Historically, there has been an 80-20 split between funding roads versus transit, but states have the ability to flex some of their highway dollars to invest in transit, and they choose not to. I'm hopeful that we won't give up or don't pass on these opportunities over the next 5 years, and the millionaire's tax passing is one way to do it.
Whoa, crossing into the political issue of the day. Thank you, Madam Mayor. We're going to go to the second question. And again, we'll go back to Chris. Essentially, obviously, there's a number of modes that fall on the MBTA. You get heavy rail, light rail, bus, ferry. Which one of these should have more emphasis, if any, or which one should we focus on growing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mayor. As I thought about this question heading into the forum, I have a clear answer here, and maybe it's a little bit controversial, meant to spark some conversation. But I think the clear answer to that question is bus. I think we do not pay nearly enough attention to our bus riders. By the way, I'm one of them. I know the mayor, Mayor Ballantyne, is also a regular bus rider. We don't pay enough attention to our bus riders. We give them the worst quality service, and yet they are some of our most loyal customers. If you look at the ridership numbers, the bus has bounced back faster post-COVID than any other mode, and very consistently so over the last year and a half. We can talk about any number of bus lines that are core bus lines. Over the years, there's been a lot of talk about the 111 bus, which starts in Revere, picks up most of its passengers in Chelsea, goes over the Tobin Bridge, and ends its trip at Haymarket. Finally, after years of advocacy from groups like Green Routes and others in Chelsea, we were able to create bus lanes on the Tobin Bridge. Before the creation of those bus lanes, that trip would take 45 minutes to go 2.7 miles from City Hall in Chelsea to Haymarket. It would be faster to walk that distance, but it's of course illegal to walk over the Tobin Bridge. And so we forced those bus riders to be packed in like sardines on the 111 bus, 15,000 of them a day on a busy weekday. And for the privilege of being packed in like sardines and having a trip that's slower than walking, we actually made them pay more in bus fare than the toll on the Tobin Bridge for an auto ride. So we have some baked in inequities in the system. And I really applaud the work of you, Mayor Koch, Mayor Ballantyne. And it's been so delightful to see the work of Mayor Wu and Yasha and his team in advancing bus lanes throughout the region in the last 5 or 10 years. And I'll also give credit to Governor Baker there for focusing on bus lanes as a cost-effective way to move people. You have these roads throughout the region where half of all the human beings that are moving in that road are doing it in a bus. And we didn't traditionally elevate the bus as a priority, and we're now starting to make that change. I think one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about bus service is that it's both, not just that it's flexible, but also that it's inexpensive. So you can move a lot of people to various destinations and at relatively low cost, far lower capital costs than commuter rail or subway, and far lower operating costs in terms of what's coming out of people's pockets for their monthly pass. So we have to be doing more on bus, and I would suggest that it is a way to connect cities that we don't often think enough about. We've kind of reflexively gone to rail being the way to connect cities across the state. And I think we should be paying much more attention to intercity buses as a starting point to build up that ridership between different cities in the state. And once we've got that ridership built up, then converting it to rail where it makes economic sense. It's a very long answer to the question, Mayor, but we have to be elevating bus and bus riders if we want to have exactly what Yasha said we need to have, and I agree with, which is that the growth in mobility has to be through public transit. We do not have any more space for vehicles on our roads, for single occupancy vehicles on our road. It has to be through transit, and bus is a cost-effective, fast, and flexible way to do that.
Can't argue with that. Thank you, Chris. Joshua, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly won't argue with that either. I think the bus is underappreciated and underinvested in, and a huge area of opportunity for us to make some transformative change. As Chris mentioned, one of the opportunities that we have is around reprioritizing how we use public right-of-way. And this obviously challenges the traditional lens that transit is the T's business and streets are city's business. It's making the bus work is everyone's business, and we have to work together. And I think we've seen incredible strides in the last few years in that collaboration, but we need to do more. And we need to be really thoughtful, especially on the back of the T's hopefully soon finalization of the bus network redesign, to look at that network and say, what are the corridors that require bus priority? How will we build them in Boston and all of the communities that those critical bus routes travel through? The emphasis has to be on, whether we're talking about bus or commuter rail or anything else, it has to be on service quality. And what we see consistently with the bus is that when it is traveling with general traffic, the quality of the service is, as expected, as good or as bad as general traffic flow is. And that means that if we do not give buses priority, we are always going to have a bus experience that is less favorable than driving a car along that same route. Because no matter what, the bus is very unlikely to stop at exactly where you're going or start exactly where you're coming from. You typically have a walk or some other transfer on either end of it. And there's an additional time penalty for the stops associated with the bus. So in order for the bus to be successful as a primary means of transit growth, it has to be better than driving that same route. And that means we have to give the bus space. We have to be willing to take that space away from cars. We've shown that it's doable. We've shown that it works. There are some key obstacles to that. The number one thing that I would highlight is the lack of ability to do automated enforcement for bus priority. This is a critical issue. We in the city of Boston are spending tens of millions of dollars building bus lanes that we have no capacity to reliably enforce, because the only mechanism that the state legislature has seen fit to grant us is to actually have police officers, uniformed police officers on the route, pulling cars over, issuing tickets. Ample evidence that automated enforcement works. You look at what New York has done on their bus priority corridors. We need it here in Massachusetts. We need it yesterday. And the state legislature needs to act to enable the T and municipalities to put that into place. The other thing that I would say is critically important as we think about the role of the bus is to think about opportunities for better intermodal transfer. So, as an example, the West Station project that's contemplated for the Alston I-90 interchange offers a way to connect people from what will hopefully be high frequency regional rail at some point in the future to a bus network that can bring them to Kendall Square, that can bring them to the Longwood Medical area. The flexibility that Chris referenced with the bus allows it to act as a sort of last 5-mile connector for much longer journeys in ways that would be much harder, much more expensive to do with traditional light or heavy rail connections. But the value comes from that connectivity, and it comes from having the foresight to recognize the places like West Station where we need to make a sizable investment in building the kind of intermodal hub that actually allows those connections and that high quality bus service to make those transitions for passengers quickly and easily. At the end of the day, all of this comes back to this question of service experience. And whether we're investing in the bus, whether we're investing in rail, whether we're investing in regional rail, if the experience of passengers is that they've got to wait 90 minutes to catch their next train, or that the bus might take 20 minutes or it might take an hour, right? Then we are not serving those passengers well. They will not choose transit, and we will find ourselves struggling uphill against rising traffic congestion as people flee transit for those who have the choice. Flee transit for other options that are more convenient. So no matter what we are investing in, it has to be an eye towards delivering that frequency, that reliability that is so crucial to making people look at transit as an option and say, I actually want that, I prefer that.
Thank you for that. And thank you for acknowledging the T has been working the last couple of years directly with cities and towns on the bus routes, trying to create great efficiency, serve those that really need it. And try to eliminate some of those inefficiencies at the same time. So thank you. Professor.
I would concur that the opportunities with bus are far greater than they are with other forms of transportation. I think about, and as a professor at Northeastern, what role the Ruggles Station plays in bringing together commuter rail, bus, Orange Line, and other forms of transportation, I mean, blue bikes and the like. And the flexibility that's available in developing the bus system, I think far exceeds what we can do elsewhere in a highly cost-effective way. I also have to wonder, given that when I was growing up in New York, I was transported to school on public buses every day from the 4th grade on. I also wonder to what extent we may want to begin to think about using our bus system and our public transit system as a way of supplementing or replacing what many of our communities are now spending on private buses within the context of our school systems. And I think that improvements to the bus system will create opportunities for us to reduce our expenditures in other areas in ways that also develop opportunities for us to have modes of transportation that cut across the network in ways that heavy rail can't possibly do.
So having said all that, are you a Red Sox or Yankees fan?
Red Sox.
Good answer. Certainly in this forum.
No matter what happens with them, Red Sox forever.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you. So I want to say I agree with many of the comments that was said previous, and I also with Professor Landmark's agree with school buses, using public buses instead of school buses. We actually do that in Somerville, and we also give free bus passes to youth starting in the 7th grade. So as I think of my role, as mayor of Somerville, 4 square miles, I also feel that our role is to advocate for expanded, electrified, reliable regional rail systems, as well as a great urban and rural bus service. We also need to advocate for free and reduced bus fares for low income and in our environmental justice communities. Public transit, again, is an issue that affects all of Massachusetts. We need a world-class public transit system. The statewide economy depends on it. It needs to be safe, reliable, and affordable. Climate action requires safe, reliable, and affordable MBTA. Our goals of social and racial equity cannot be realized without a safe, reliable, and affordable transit system. So one of my goals as mayor is to build coalitions with my suburban and rural counterparts in local government to work towards this common goal.
Thank you, Mayor. I do want to acknowledge that at the head of the program today, Kim Driscoll spoke, the mayor of Salem, and she did mention water transportation. So I want to throw that in as a waterfront community. I think water transportation has a play in making a difference. And you look at the Hingham route, they are so loyal to people that use that because they have a great experience in that service. And I think folks, certainly from Quincy, would jump on that. More apt to do that perhaps because of that experience than jump on the red line. So I'm the moderator. I'm not supposed to get involved in opinions. I had to throw it in there.
Well, I will remind everybody, Somerville does have waterfront on the Mystic River. So we're happy to take water services from Boston and the surrounding communities over to the assembly area.
Fair enough. We have a number of major cities that have waterfront property, and a lot of cities in the world that do a much better job with water transportation. And I think we could certainly do better. The last question for each of us today is really each of you, if you could answer the question about what is your vision? What does the T look like next 10 years, next 25 years, next 50 years? And that could include the structure of the T, that could include how we service, how the fares are, what kind of vehicles we're using, but your thoughts about, and honestly, it's been talked about really today in the other panels. This is all about the future of the T. This is about making those system changes that are going to help the next generation, because for too long, as we know, for decades, the T wasn't properly funded in this area. So Chris, floor is yours.
Thanks, Mayor. I want to build a little bit on a theme that Yasha talked about. He talked about how closely the city of Boston is now working with the MBTA on making sure that we think of our roads as spaces for transit and not have them separate in some way. That's very much a best practice. You go to a place like Seattle, and the Seattle City DOT will have employees that actually sit in the offices of the King County Metro and vice versa, because they want to be so well coordinated. Bus service is really important in Seattle. And I actually have friends in Seattle who bought their home based on a bus line, which is an experience a lot of us have in Massachusetts. You want to live near a rail line, they actually base it on a bus line because the bus service is so important. I think we should be taking a somewhat similar approach, and I want to be very clear, probably not in the next 10 years, but in the next 15, 20, 25, or 50 years, to better integrate our transit and our road system, especially within 128 and even more broadly across greater Boston and eastern Massachusetts. You already heard me share that I think buses are a hugely important way to be moving people. And that means that we need to better integrate the decisions that MassDOT as a highway entity is making, and that MassDOT with its sort of sub-entity of the MBTA is making on the transit side. We don't do a good job of that today. In fact, we do a very poor job of that today as we think about transportation governance. Those of you that have heard me speak on this topic over the years will have heard this fact before, but I'm going to share it again because I think it's so powerful. In the last 31 years, so since Governor Dukakis left office in 1991, we have raised the gas tax in Massachusetts a total of 3 cents. That amounts to 14% in 31 years. In the same period of time, we have raised MBTA commuter rail fares 250%. So the message that we have sent to the people of Massachusetts over the last 30 years is drive more and take transit less. And people have responded to that message. We have the worst congestion in the country. We have MBTA ridership that even pre-COVID was basically flat from where it had been in the 1990s, no significant increases. And then we sort of scratch our heads and we wonder why we have all this congestion where people are responding to exactly the incentives that we have provided them. A longer term view about mobility in Greater Boston would be one where we can better balance the incentives that we are providing to move around the region via transit versus driving. And there are cities around the world that do a much better job of doing that. Two in particular, and I know they're much bigger than Greater Boston, but both in New York and in London, the parts of the road network are entirely integrated with the transit network in the form of the MTA in New York and Transport for London in London. In New York, for decades now, for 70 or 80 years, tolls from the major bridges that get you in and out of Manhattan have been used to subsidize transit. Same thing is true in London, where charges from the congestion pricing scheme there subsidize transit. We basically do the opposite here, where we don't really ask drivers to pay for the cost that they impose on others, including other drivers, when they drive in Greater Boston. And I understand that that's a politically very difficult topic, but until we address that political topic, we're not going to get the reduction in congestion and air pollution and frustration that we have. We have to deal with that seriously. We have to deal with it delicately and carefully, but a longer term view would have a governance system that would better balance those competing demands. And I would suggest would leave everyone across the region better off, whether there's someone that is only going to drive, that's the only way they want to get around, would still be better off through reduced congestion, or someone that doesn't take the T or drive and just walks everywhere will have better air quality and safer streets. If you're a business owner, if you're a homeowner, if you're a renter, if you're a local leader, you are going to be better off in a system that better balances those competing demands. And I hope that we can take some baby steps there. We're not going to get it in the next 10 years, but we could be there in a 20 or 25 year time frame. And we need to be thinking that long term when it comes to some of these decisions.
So you're speaking of some real systemic changes, and it back to the underlying common denominator is Americans are in love with their automobiles, perhaps less so in the urban centers, but and at the end we got to deliver safe, reliable, good experience, no matter what mode it is, to get them out of that car. But I think those are all worthy of discussion. Chris, Chief, you want to give it a whirl?
Sure, yeah. And I'll just say, I think Americans have ambivalent relationships with their automobiles. For most Americans, they have no choice but to drive, and our job should be to create choices that can compete with automobile travel for people. I will frame my vision in a little hypothetical story, which is a person who lives in Mattapan in Boston, who on a Friday morning gets on the 28 bus, which is fare free and electric, on Blue Hill Ave, takes it directly to her job at Children's Hospital in the morning. She completes her workday. She leaves her job. She gets back on the bus. She takes it out to West Station, which is now complete. She hops on an electrified commuter rail service, regional rail service with 15-minute frequency to go stay with her sister in Framingham overnight. The next morning, she gets up, gets back on the train, hops back into Boston, doesn't have to look at the schedule because she knows the train is going to be there and it's going to be reliable and it's going to be allow her to get right back to where she needs to go home for the weekend. That's a story, right, that is not that far-fetched. We're starting to put some of the pieces of that in place. We have bus network redesign. We're planning for West Station. There's been a lot of great thinking done about regional rail. There's been investments made around bus electrification. But we have a long way to go to get from where we are today to where that kind of reality could happen. And there's a million stories like that. And you can create your own, based on your vision of where we should be investing and what our priorities need to be. But I think the challenge we have is that while we've sketched some of the pieces that would need to exist for a future like that to happen, we haven't made the clear and consistent commitment to the funding that's going to be necessary to get us there, and to the long-term expansion projects, the vision of growth built around investment in the transit system that's going to be necessary for that to be a real and successful outcome. And the thing that I find, challenging about this, right, is that a lot of great work has been done. If you read the Focus 40, report from a number of years ago that the T put together, this is their sort of, 2040 transportation vision. A lot of the elements of a future transit system are there. The problem is they're all listed in a section called what we're imagining, right? If you look at the sections that say what we're building and what we're planning, everything there is reliability and modernization. And that's great and important and critically important that we do those reliability and modernization improvements. But if our vision ends at those two things of reliability and modernization, if we can't get beyond imagining and get to planning for some of the bigger investments that could actually be regionally transformative, then we're going to be stuck in the same old pattern that we're in right now. So I think for me, when I think about a vision for the future, it is continuing to make those thoughtful investments in delivering reliable, affordable, safe service on the core system as we know it today. But it's also being willing to have political leadership that will be out there saying, if we want this future for our region, here are the things we're going to have to figure out how to build. And some of them will take time. I mean, you look at some of the transformative rail and bus projects that have happened elsewhere in the US, in Seattle, in Los Angeles, or further afield in places like London. These projects can take decades to really come to complete fruition. But we need political leadership that's willing to, show with confidence that we can continue to work on the challenges we have today and build towards that future. And we have not had that. And I think that notion of getting away from just imagination and into really brass tacks. What's it going to cost? What are we going to prioritize? What resources and staff and organizational structures do we need to deliver on these projects? Let's do that work and not just keep kicking the can down the road.
Thank you, Yasha. I don't disagree with all that, but I will say this, that I will give the political leadership currently in the corner office great credit, Governor Baker, for taking on the T, but rarely grabbing the bull by the horns, where a lot of governors just kind of, well, that's an authority, it's a separate operation, they'll figure it out. Nobody wanted to touch it. So I certainly want to acknowledge Governor Baker's leadership on this. And it was decades of catch up, quite frankly, as I know some of the other panelists kind of touched on that. We have a long way to go, but some nice thoughts there, Yasha. Thank you. Professor.
For me, the greatest change I would like to see would be a change in attitude towards public transit in general, and towards the operations of the T in particular. When I was on the T board, we focused on who our riders were and what it would take for them to feel as though they were comfortable and safe and in a place where they wanted to be every day. And as much as we say that Americans love our cars, there's a huge gap between what we see in a TV ad for driving and what we actually experience on 93 when we're sitting in traffic, either coming or going from town. And I would submit that part of the problem that we're dealing with here is one wherein we don't take seriously enough the needs of the ridership and what it is that it would take more people to use the system. When I was on the T board, we instituted announcements and T stops so that people would know how long they might have to wait if a train was delayed. Well, now we have apps that have replaced that. We put music and art in stations. We made it possible for people with disabilities to be able to access stations because we began to install elevators and the like. And my view is that we don't have enough input into the system from those people who actually use it. The leadership of all aspects of the transit system is not diverse. whether we're talking about who sits on our boards or who actually staffs the organizations, the training links that we could create between our schools and the careers that exist within public transit simply don't exist. We don't incentivize young people in cities to think about long-term careers in a system that aren't going to go away the way certain types of careers come and go. So for me, we can talk about automation, which is important. We have to talk about safety. But I think the biggest difference that I would hope for looking forward is a change in our attitude towards the role that public transit plays within our region, so that it's not viewed simply from a cost-benefit analysis, but is also viewed in terms of the service that it provides to all kinds of people, and what it is we need to do and pay for to make that service more than acceptable, but really the kind of service that people want to use in order to get out of their cars.
Absolutely agree with that. It's about the experience in the end, right? Madam Mayor?
Thank you. And I want to echo that I agree with, the comments that my esteemed panelists here have also shared. And this is the part that I think is the funnest, because we get to dream, we get to a vision. I don't have to have it, constrained. So the dream, as you've heard me say this, is I want to be able to hear that our leadership in the state of Massachusetts says they want Massachusetts to have a world-class public transit system. I haven't heard it. I hear little pieces, and it's sort of, it's project-based and moving, or it's the piece of it. But what's that overarching vision that we're all working towards? And for me, what I would imagine and dream for is an administration that is yelling from the treetops that they want Massachusetts to have a world-class public transit system. Again, why? Because public transit is good for everyone. It's good for employers, it's good for employees. Employers and employees can get to work, and it's good for the justices, environmental justice, racial justice, social justice. And we have the potential in Massachusetts because we have the brain trust. We have all the experts here, and they can get it right. We can have this. And so starting off that way then addresses the urgency of our time today, and it demands change. So what is the vision? The ideas that I have is I see and I envision us using public transportation as a key component to addressing what our communities look like. We're talking about 50, 70 years from now, and how it feels and how our community grows. And we also use public transit to address housing, environmental, and cost of living. So the first idea is building a 15-minute economy. In Somerville, residents constantly tell me they want 15 minutes community. Think about it. Neighborhoods that allow you to access most of the essential goods, services, and relationships within 15 minutes of travel. In a place like Somerville, that goal requires frequent, reliable MBTA bus service. When buses are running on time, most of our residents can get to grocery stores, schools, parks, cultural, faith destinations with flexibility and confidence. What are we talking about here is mobility equity, being free to travel when and where you need to at the price you can afford. We can't achieve this vision without a safe, reliable, and affordable MBTA. So now second is addressing the housing crisis. Eastern Massachusetts is facing a housing emergency. Prices have risen so fast for so long, people can't keep up. And of course, this challenge is felt most acutely by low income and people of color. There is a role for public transportation to help address the housing crisis. We can expand existing lines to encompass more communities, be it Arlington or Lynn, and use the expansion to build affordable housing around transportation nodes. We can create 15-minute communities in every part of the state. The third vision I have is about our economy and the cost of living. When companies choose to grow in a particular state or move to one, it is based on many factors, including the available talent pool, which Massachusetts certainly has, and the quality of life for employees. In Massachusetts, we have the talent pool, but we risk on the quality of life. If we have failed in our public transportation system, employers and employees will actively look to other locations to reside if the commute to work remains untenable. We do not have the space, nor should we build wider highways, but we can improve our public transportation. And, I just also want to say, as I had my staff pull some data, and research has shown in the US, we roughly spend $3,000 per capita per year on automobile infrastructure. Public transportation, by comparison, roughly receives $300 per capita per year. So we're talking about 10 times as much spending on driving versus on transit. I think that's a point that we should, pay attention to. Also, public transportation needs to be safe, reliable. As I've said, it can lower the costs of living. In Somerville, it costs about $10,000 to have a car. If residents can go from 2 to 1 car, that will save them money. If they can go from 1 car to only using public transit, that will save them money and thousands in a given year. But they have to know that the MBTA is viewed as a safe, reliable, and affordable. And then finally, it's taking on the climate crisis. Our society is facing a climate crisis. In Somerville, our community demands that we act aggressively to reduce emissions. As mayor, I've established a goal of not only eliminating emissions, but delivering on carbon negative strategy. And transportation is one of the keys to this strategy. We cannot address the climate crisis without getting cars off the road. In our little city of 4 square miles and 80,000 people, roughly 35% of our emissions are from transportation, meaning vehicle trips start and end in Somerville. So if we want a world-class MBTA, that people have confidence in and can trust in, this is one of the ways we can address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. That brings us really to the end of our time allotted. So I want to thank each of the panelists for taking the time out to be part of a thoughtful discussion about going forward. I think one of the frustrations I've seen is some of my colleagues in government, rather than being part of the solution, but merely being critical of issues without coming up with those solutions. So the only way we're going to fix this is working together going forward. And again, I appreciate each of you today, Chris, Yasha, Ted, and Mayor. Thank you for putting your time in and sharing your insights with the 100 so forth participants today, which represent a number of the communities, as we know, in the district. So thank you very much. And a broader thank you to all the panelists today. Incredible work. The same goes to them. There's so many amazing public service over the years, many of them relying are really around transportation and have contributed over the years. God, when you see Fred Salvucci on the panel, you think back on the pre-big dig stuff and discussions on to resolve some of those issues. So thank you to all the panelists on each of the 3 panel discussions today. Thank you to Brian Koehn for coordinating the event today. Really appreciate that. And to the advisory board members who continually represent their community. And it was said by more than one panelist today, I think Tim and Murray might have mentioned it, the importance of the local officials. That's where the rubber hits the road on these issues. to continue to educate your community, your boards of selectmen, your city council, and make sure they're connected along with our local legislators as we go forward, because this isn't going on the back burner, the issues of public transportation in Massachusetts. It's on the front burner now, and it's time that we come up with some collective solutions going forward. And I know not everyone's going to get what they want. That's part of life, right? But I think we can do a whole lot better. So with that, I'll turn it back to Brian for conclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to note that the recording of this entire event will be available on mbtaadvisoryboard.org very soon. We will expedite its posting. Special thanks to those who made this possible: Matt Moran, Matt Mariano, Jacob Riesdorf, Dennis Kennedy, Tom McShane, Jen Manley, Joe Rica, Amira Patterson, and Deborah West. I thank you all for your attending, and we will solve this problem one way or another. We just got to work together. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.